What's up everyone, I'm Earl the Rookie Woodworker, and for today's video I'm going to work on a chessboard that has drawers built in underneath it to fit all of the chess pieces. So let's pick out some wood and get to work. Alright, so to start this project out I'm going to go straight for the top and I'm going to make it out of maple and walnut wood. I'm going to make this thing 16 by 16 inches wide, so I'm going to cut these pieces to be 18 inches long. The reason I go with this extra length is to one, give me a little bit of extra tolerance so when I glue it up the ends don't have to be absolutely perfect, and two, every time you make a slice through it with that chop saw, it's going to take an extra eighth of an inch off of it. So you need an extra 2 inches for this. And from there I kick off the milling process by using a joiner to get a flat side and a flat edge. The walnut pieces was a little bit too big for the joiner, so I had to cut it up and then run it through the joiner. Then once that's accomplished, I'll run everything through the planer to get a nice uniform thickness across all of these boards. I think in the end I ended up going with I think 5/8 of an inch of thickness for the top for this. So with a chessboard or checkers board, whichever one you're going to play on this, you have 8 squares by 8 squares. So we're going for 16 inches wide. 16 divided by 8 is 2. So we want to cut these strips down to 2-inch wide strips. Then after that, we need to get a nice perfect shuffle. So smooth. Then it's time to just glue them up. It's pretty much the exact same process gluing this up as you would if you were making a cutting board. You might actually notice that I'm using my glue roller instead of my fingers to spread the glue around this time. So that's an improvement. Even though later on I went and ate my mac and cheese with my hands like a caveman. And then once that's dry, it'll be time to chop it up. So I'm going to use the crosscut sled to go ahead and square up the one side, and then with that squared up side I'm just going to use the table saw and the regular old fence to make the rest of the cuts. I'll take the time to readjust my blade height since I took the crosscut sled off of it. I don't get too overly picky here. I just shoot for being able to see about 5 to 8 teeth sticking out from the top of my workpiece. And now that we're chopping it up, we want to make sure that our pieces are the same width as our strips. We want 2 inches for the strips. We're going to go for 2 inches here again. A nice even number makes this project nice and gravy. Now for this glue up, all we want to do is flip every other strip that we cut out on the table saw, and that'll create our checkerboard pattern. So we'll go ahead and glue this thing up and use the roller to smear the glue on and clamp it down. So while that's drying up in the clamps, I'm going to start working on the base for this. Now the base for this is going to have a drawer on each side for the different pieces that go with the chessboard. Now the base is going to match the top. It's going to be made out of walnut and maple. The framework is going to be made out of walnut, and then the drawer faces are going to be made out of maple, and then we might throw some maple splines in it as well. So with that being said, I'm going to chop up some walnut and start milling it all down. So over here on the joiner, I'm going to work in a flat side and a flat edge before I end up going over to the planer to get a uniform thickness out of these pieces. Just look at that little fella just eat. That machine has an appetite for some wood, that's for sure. Now this cut here is what's going to determine the height of the base that's underneath our checkerboard. I'm going with 4 inches, so I'm cutting these down to be 4 inches wide. Now I'm going to set the height of my regular table saw blade so that I can cut a groove in those pieces so that I can put a bottom in this thing. For this, I usually bring the blade slightly past my setup block and then I raise it up to the setup block. It's important to raise it up to the setup block. The reason it's important to raise the blade up to the setup block is because you want to make sure there's no slack in the mechanics that raises that blade up, because once you start cutting, that slack will start lowering that blade back down until it's tight again. Now the bottom I'm going to be putting in this is going to be just a sheet of 1/4 inch plywood. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run all these pieces through one time, and I'm going to bump the fence over and I'm going to run them through again. Now I might be able to achieve this in 2 times because the blade is 1/8 of an inch thick, so 2/8 can be 1/4 of an inch if I get it right, but usually it takes me a 3rd time because I'm not too aggressive with the bump out. Alright, so at this point I realized that I need to knock 1/4 inch off of the measurement that I had for the height of this box. And that's because the way I'm going to cut the holes for the drawers, I'm going to cut a strip off the top and the bottom, and then I'll just cut that middle out and then glue those strips back together. So I'll have to do that with 2 of the sides, and then I'll have to go back and knock 1/4 inch off of the other 2 sides. And this is where I'm cutting the middle out of the piece. Now when you're cutting the middle out of the piece, it's a little bit awkward, so you got to remember to keep the blade on the middle of the piece side of the line that you're cutting, so that the thickness of your blade is cutting out of the chunk that's in the middle, that's being the discarded piece. If you don't remember that, what ends up happening is you cut on the outside of that line and you end up widening that hole by 1/8 of an inch, or times 2, because this is 2 different cuts, it ends up widening the hole by 1/4 of an inch. And this is what the process of gluing those back up look like. You want to glue these back up exactly the way they were cut apart. You want to line up the grain to look exactly right. And whenever you do this, it should look pretty much like it was never cut to begin with. You can expect a little bit of grain misalignment because you are removing 1/8 of an inch of material with every cut that you make. So there's going to be a little bit of grain misalignment. But from a distance, this piece should look like it was never cut to begin with. So while that dries up, I'm going to cut down a piece of maple, and then I'm going to mill that up for the drawer faces. And then I'm going to get to work on the top as well. I definitely do not have a planer that's wide enough to plane this thing down, but I do have a drum sander that's wide enough to plane it down. So I'm going to use the drum sander, get this surface nice and flat and ready to work into this thing. So at this point I'm going to add some pieces of particle board to the bottom of the chessboard itself, and they're going to butt right up against where the box is going to be. That way the box has more material to grab a hold of with the wood glue. This is probably not necessary, but I would rather overbuild than underbuild. So now what I'm going to do is glue a piece of wood right down the middle of this board. Now what this piece of wood is for is to hold the latches to the drawers. Now these latches will be like the pincher kind of latches, so the drawer will slide back and hit those latches, and it'll hold there a little bit and take some friction to pull the drawers out. That way the drawers don't freely fall out when you carry this thing around. So now I'll take some 3/4 material that magically has a dado already cut in it for a drawer bottom and chop that up to turn it into some drawers. And I'll slice and dice some 1/4 inch material to make some bottoms out of it. Then on the back of these drawers I'll mount these pieces of wood that have the latch pinchers attached to them. Alright, so now that my box sides are all dried up, it's time to miter the ends and turn this thing into a box. And then I'll cut out the big bottom for this box. I didn't have a big enough piece of scrap for this, so I ended up cutting it out of a pretty good piece of 1/4-inch plywood. Alright, so now I'll just glue this thing up and go directly to a test fit. But yeah, I'm using just blue painter's tape as the clamps to hold this thing together. I've gone through a couple different of those fancy box clamps and stuff like that, and none of them are as easy to use or as fast or even as good as blue painter's tape. That's the way to go, man. After it dries, I put it in a spline jig and I cut 2 slots at the top and the bottom of each corner, which are going to get some splines that help strengthen those miter joints. This way our box should be durable for many years to come. I recently saw a video where somebody was making an adjustment on a board that was in a jig like this, but he left the table saw running. Well, that board fell down, hit the blade of the table saw, popped back and hit him right in the chest. So make sure your table saw is shut off when you're making these adjustments, just for safety purposes. So for the splines, the table saw blade is 1/8 of an inch thick. Went through with one pass, so it should be 1/8 of an inch wide. So we need to work down some material to 1/8 of an inch thick. So I got some scrap maple, running it through the planer. I find getting it down to about 1/4 inch is about the thinnest I like to go before the planer starts chewing it up and spitting out pieces of it. So then I switch over to the drum sander to get it the rest of the way down to 1/8 of an inch thick, because it's just safer to do it that way rather than having your planer spit pieces across the shop. Speaking of safety, after watching this video a little closer, I think I should change how I'm doing this and stop reaching across it to pick it up from the other side, because every time I reach across it, you can see that belt trying to pull my shirt a little bit towards the machine. I don't think I'm in danger of getting pulled into the machine, but it would suck to have a shirt ripped off of you. I don't think it'll be not painful, so maybe I ought to change that up, change that habit. So now I want to take my spline material, I'm going to stick it in a slot, and I'm going to trace the slot with a pencil. But I'm going to use the thickness of the pencil to make the outline of the slot just slightly oversized. That way whenever I go gluing it in there, I don't end up with any of it that's actually recessed a little bit. I want it to stick out just a little bit everywhere I stick one of these splines in. Then I just chop them all up at the bandsaw. Then to glue them in, I try to touch every little surface of the inside of those slots with glue as much as possible. Then just shove those splines in the whole way. You want to make sure that bottom's out or you'll end up with a little gap there. So yeah, shove them the whole way in there, and then you'll see that they stick out just a little bit where we gave it that extra room with the thickness of the pencil. Then while that's drying, I'm going to put these pieces on the bottom, which should align the drawers nice and straight so that they don't turn a little bit inside the box and bind themselves up. So this should help keep them moving in and out nice and straight, nice and smoothly. So now I'm going to go all the way back to that piece of wood that I milled down for the drawer faces way back in the video, and I'm going to chop that up into 2 different drawer faces. I'm cutting them down here to fit inside those holes that I put in the sides for the drawers perfectly. I'm going to leave about a 1/16 of an inch of clearance, so they're going to fit in there nice and tight. And then we're going to secure them to the front of the drawers. For that, I'm going to use some type 2 type on wood glue, and I'm going to glue it to the drawers, and then I'm going to go back and tap it with a brad nailer a few times from the inside of the drawers. And then I'm going to clamp it and let it sit for a bit because we like to do things a little bit overdone around here. So to get the drawer latches to line up, I needed to get creative because they're inside a closed box that I can't exactly get my hands to. Now I could get fancy with some measurements, but I think I got a little bit easier of an idea here. So what I did here is I stuffed the tip of a Sharpie into the pincher of the latch, which is located on the back of the drawer. So then I take that drawer and I push it all the way in, and that Sharpie will mark exactly where the other part of the latch is supposed to be located. Rinse and repeat on the other side. And this is the way those marks look, and that's exactly where I need to put the other part of the latch. So let's do that for a while. And just like that, the drawers slide in there and latch perfectly. So now I'm going to chop up some pieces that I'm going to mount to the back of the drawers. The idea of these pieces are that they're going to work as drawer stops so that the drawers don't pull completely out of this box. When you get to carrying this box around, you don't want your drawers to be able to just freely fall out of the box. So we're going to put some drawer stops on the back to make sure that that does not happen. So before I go gluing the top of this box onto it, I'm going to go ahead and oil the whole inside of this box, making sure that the inside is just as protected as the outside. While I'm oiling the inside of this box, I want to keep in mind that I don't want to get any oil where I need glue to hold the lid in place. So keep that in mind while oiling the inside of a box. If you're putting a lid on it, you don't want to have oil where the wood glue needs to penetrate the wood, or else the wood glue is not going to penetrate and hold onto that lid. And now it's time to start gluing that lid on, or the top, I should say. Then after that dries and is nice and firmly in place, I'll sand everything all the way from 80 grit down to 220 grit sandpaper. I'm going to do this with the drawers in. It'll help make sure the faces are perfectly aligned as well. Then what I do is I mist it with water, not just to make it look pretty, but to get it wet, and then I'm going to let that dry. And then whenever you go back, you'll find the grains popping out a little bit, and then we'll just sand that back off, and we'll do that about 2 times. Now because I can't pull the drawers out without handles, I'm going to install some handles. So I'm going to cut some handles out of some walnut. I'm going to put a 20-degree angle on all sides, and we'll slap them babies on. Now to get these drawer handles to stick, I'm going to use some wood glue, but I'm also going to use a dowel rod that goes right into the middle of the drawer handle through to the middle of the drawer face. That way it has a little bit extra material to grab a hold of and stick together. And after the handles all dried up and are nice and secure, it's time to oil this thing up. This is my favorite part of a project, is putting some finish on and watching the thing come to life. And for a final touch, I'm going to put some feet on the bottom of this thing. Now, because the bottom is a 1/4 inch panel of plywood, I'm going to go ahead and put a little dab of epoxy on the bottom of these feet as well as the screws for a little bit of extra holding power. Just because the screws only have a 1/4 inch plywood to grab a hold of with the threads, I felt that I probably need a little bit extra reinforcement there. And that is it for this build. If you enjoyed this build, do me a favor and hit that like button. If you want to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button and check out the other videos at the channel. Till next time, make something awesome.